Hi everybody, this is Kelsi at Ritter's. Today we're going to do a class on Houseplant 101, Water, Light, and Love. So we do this class every year. That's our plan, is to do this every year. So this is the second time we've done this. And I think it's kind of fun because I kind of can go over the things that I think I know and sort of see how that's evolved over the last year. So it was kind of fun for me to do this. And I think that's really actually a really good thing, and I think it's really normal. You know, maybe a year ago you used to say something a little bit different, and then a year later you've learned something new about how to take care of your plants, and it's just kind of fun to see how you've grown. So if I know maybe some of you are doing this class again. I know last time we did it in person, but that's not a bad thing, because you probably will understand things a little bit differently than you did a year ago, and it deepens your understanding and your knowledge about how to better take care of your plants. So let's get right into it. We're going to start with water. So the first thing is how much water, and what I mean by this is the amount of water that you water with. And I know that sounds strange maybe to some people because you just water your plant, but it is important with some plants to maybe not give them as much water, or to maybe make sure the soil is wet completely through. And that's going to vary from plant to plant, and you can mostly categorize this into different types, but every plant's going to be just a little bit different. And it's just going to take experience to learn that. Basically, the main principle of this is the more water you put in there, the longer it's going to take to dry out. So the plants that you have that say they don't really like to be super wet for long periods of time, such as a Chinese evergreen, like this guy right here, you aren't going to put as much water in there because you just don't want it to stay wet quite as long. Some plants, maybe they like to be consistently wet, but they just don't like their soil to be soaked. So a calathea kind of falls into that category. They never want to dry out, but they certainly don't like to be soaked. So you're just going to kind of give them a little bit more frequently, and that's going to keep them a little bit happier. So a fern is one, which I didn't grab one, is something that you're not too worried about how much water. You just want to make sure it's thoroughly wet through the whole soil profile. So as you can see, there's a pretty big variance of the amount of water that you want to do, and it is very individualized to each plant, but you kind of will learn it as you go. So the next important thing with watering is when to water. So this is kind of how when we get into categories. So the first category that I like to say is keep consistently moist. So this is things like ferns, calatheas, and peace lilies, and a lot more plants than that. But generally those ones, and these are ones that you're going to check every few days. You're going to touch the surface of the soil, and if the surface of the soil starts to feel a little bit dry, you're going to give it a little bit of water. With a fern, when it's dry, you're just going to water it through. With a calathea, you're just going to give it enough just to wet the surface and maybe get the lower soil profile wet again. The next one is medium water. These are going to be your very typical plants. It's going to be your spider plants, your philodendrons, some palms, and wandering dude, any of those kind of typical plants. Peperomia, pilea sometimes will fall into that category, and these are the ones that I always just say water it once a week, you'll be fine. These aren't the picky plants. They're not going to be fussy one way or another. These ones, again, I say touch the surface before you water, because some of these plants, they don't want to be overly wet. So you do want to make sure that they're dry enough to warrant watering them. In terms of amount of water, again, you're going to kind of have to adjust it based on what you find. So with these kind of what I like to do is check them every few days, maybe 4, 5, 6 days, just check them. Or maybe just say, okay, I'm gonna water these once a week, check it before you water it, and let's say your watering day is Sunday and you're like, oh, it's still kind of wet. Okay, so maybe I need to go 8 or 9 days in between waterings, and you just kind of adjust it as needed. Or maybe I'm gonna just water it a little bit less water so it dries out a little bit quicker. So you're kind of gonna do those kinds of things. But again, these plants, when I say medium water, they're not very picky. So spider plants, wandering dude, philodendron, and pretty much most of your typical plants that are very well known as easy care plants. The next category is mostly dry. This is a lot of easy plants, like snake plants, like this guy, and Chinese evergreen, this one. But it does have some difficult plants like ficus. A lot of people fight with their ficus because they think it's in the medium water category, but actually it's in the mostly dry, because they just don't like a ton of water. And that's probably one of my poster childs for the concept of amount of water, because ficus, Trina here, she likes to say pool it on the top and then stop. Ficus is one of those. You just pool it on the top. You don't want to water it so much that you're pouring water into the water dish or into your sink or whatever. You just want to water it just enough that it wets the soil profile, but not so much that it soaks the soil profile. So with these plants, what I like to do, say, okay, you let them get to the point where you're like, okay, this needs water. It's dry a couple inches down, and it's time to water it. Okay, so give it, let's say it's a 6-inch plant. Give it like a 1/4 cup of water, and then watch. See if it drips out the bottom. Okay, it hasn't dripped out the bottom. Okay, another 1/4 cup of water. Okay, now I'm starting to see drip out the bottom. So now you know that plant takes about a 1/2 cup of water, and then you can say, okay, I'll check it in 7 days, and maybe it's still wet. So you say, okay, 9 days. You check it in 7 days, and you're like, oh, it got a little too dry. So then you say, okay, 6 days. And that's why a plant journal is a lot of fun, is because you can kind of keep these notes and keep track of these things. So Chinese evergreen, pothos, ficus, and most of the palms. Again, the palms kind of go back and forth between medium water and mostly dry. So the last category is dry. Dry plants are your succulents and your cactus. Snake plants are another one that's dry. There's a couple others. These ones need to be dry all the way through. So you're just gonna check it. You're gonna lift the pot. You're gonna stick your finger in the soil, whatever it takes. And when it's dry completely through, you water it. Some of these, like in the winter, I don't think I would ever water a snake plant or a succulent or a cactus completely through the soil profile. I would just give it enough just to kind of wet it. But in the summer, when it's really hot and it's getting full sun, I would probably water it all the way through and then wait till it gets dry. Because if you water it, if you do it that way in the winter, it's gonna stay wet for too long and it's gonna rot. So there's a few things that influence water usage that you should just be aware of. Soil type, cactus mix versus potting soil versus African violet soil. Typically finer particles and less of a grittiness is gonna hold more water. Larger particles and more grittiness is gonna hold less water. So, and each brand is gonna vary. So just be aware of how your soil feels, and know that if your plants are in different soils, they're gonna dry out at different rates, most likely. The root to soil ratio, if a plant is really pot bound, it's gonna use more water because there's a lot more roots in there drinking water. And that's kind of why it's good to pot up plants when they're pot bound. Some don't care, like snake plants don't care, whatever. Pot bound is fine because they like to be dry. So just be aware of that. Plant growth rate, part of the reason peace lilies really use so much water is, one, they do like to be wet, and two, they grow really fast. So they're putting out these big leaves over and over again, and so plants that grow really quickly, they're gonna need more water, obviously, because that is what fuels growth. So amount of water applied at a time, we've talked about that, keep an eye on that. The biggest thing is light. A plant, you take two of the same plant and you put one in bright light and you put one in a little bit lower light. The lower light one, it's not going to use as much water. It could be a difference of even a week. So if you have a calathea in a really bright room and then you have a calathea maybe in your bedroom where the shades are closed a lot, that calathea in your bedroom, you're not going to need to water as much. So as much as I like the idea of a schedule, I don't love it because you need to be adaptable with your plants as the seasons change and as their environment changes. The last thing is always touch the soil or pick up the plant to feel for weight. The weight of this plant is much different than the weight of this plant because this one likes to be a little bit wetter and this one likes to be drier. So the weight is quite a bit different. So get to know the weight of your plant. And then you can kind of start to tell. You can also just touch the soil. Some people can't do the weight thing. It just depends. A really good method that Trina also uses that I have always wanted to implement at my house, but I never do it, is the chopstick method. And you just stick a wooden chopstick down in the soil, and if it comes out wet, then you know there's moisture in there. And the benefit is it gets way down in there where your finger might not be able to reach. So we're going to move on to light. Again, the light, we're gonna try to categorize it, but plants are adaptable. If you adjust your watering, sometimes you can fudge the light just a little bit. Usually you can't go up or down one group, and you can't change it by too much, but it's not an end-all be-all. So low light, this might be an office with only fluorescent lighting. This might be a north window. It could be a corner in a room with a south-facing window that maybe is obstructed by a tree, or the plant just isn't in front of the window. I mean, there's no direct light. So watch how the sun traces across your windows, and if the plant is where there's no direct sun, that's not necessarily really bright light. So low light can be anywhere where there's no direct light whatsoever, and the places where there's low light is endless in your house. Indirect bright light is going to be east or bright north facing, and then sometimes it can be west facing or even south facing if it's far away from a window, or again like there's a tree or something outside. A bright window is going to be a south-facing window with direct light, no obstructions. A west-facing window sometimes can be considered bright as well, especially if there's no obstructions and it's right by the window. Things that influence light, obstructions, even a sheer curtain, it might seem like it's bright to you, but that cuts a ton of the light out. Any awnings that are outside, and then again, like the placement in the room, the distance. Is it directly in front of the window? Is it off to the side? Is it in a corner? Is it on a table like 15 feet from a south-facing window? That's not bright light, even though there's a south-facing window. So just keep those things in mind. And the last one we're going to talk about is love. And love is the category of things that maybe you don't usually think about and aren't necessary, but it's just the extra love that we give to our plants, because plants can't live without water and light, and they might survive without love, but they need that to thrive and look beautiful. So in this category I have humidity, and most plants, with a few exceptions, like maybe succulents, cactus, snake plants, even snake plants could benefit from a little bit of ambient humidity. Our region in Spokane here is very dry. So whatever you can do to increase the humidity in your house right where your plants are is very helpful. It makes loads of difference. I mean, it's night and day. Over a period of few months, you'll notice that your plants are happier with a little bit extra humidity. This can be achieved with a humidifier. It can be achieved with dishes of rocks with water, misting bottles. And the misting bottles, you're going to have to do that at least once a day to really make a big difference, even more than that, honestly. But anything is better than nothing. And like you can site your plants accordingly. Like in the kitchen, it's a little bit more humid, especially if you do your dishes by hand in the sink. In your bathroom, it's going to be way more humid than anywhere else. So plants like anthuriums and calatheas really appreciate situations like that. A lot of plants can survive without humidity. Some can't, but all plants mostly will appreciate it. Scouting for insects. Every time you water, look at the bottoms of the leaves. Look in the little crevices, in the leaf axils of your calatheas for mealybugs. And just keep an eye out for anything odd and weird that might be a sign of an insect. There's lots of different things that can happen from insects that you wouldn't suspect. Repotting is another thing. Generally, it's going to be 1 to 3 years. With larger plants, it could be up to 5. Just check them. Pull the plant out of the pot. Look at the roots. See if it's root bound. You don't need to worry too much unless they're really, really, really root bound. But when you start to see some circling roots, it's time. Sometimes I'll just touch the soil kind of on the edge of the pot. And if it's really firm, probably needs to be repotted because that means there's a bunch of circling roots on that. If it's in a plastic pot, you can squeeze the pot and kind of feel the firmness. And if it's really firm, it's probably time for a repot. And I don't know, but the really best way is to just pull it out of the pot and just look. If it comes out really easily and the root system is really loose, it's not time. If it comes out, if it's hard to get it out and it's like stuck to the sides, it's probably time. And always use a good quality potting soil. I have heard from friends a lot of horror stories about using some potting soil they bought at Walmart, and it's like, why is my plant dying? And I'm like, well, you bought $3 potting soil. So it is important to use good quality potting soil. Organic or not, it's a preference. But Spoma is a good brand. We carry G&B. G&B is a good brand. Any brand that you find at a local place or that's a pretty well-known brand, other than Miracle Grow, is gonna be fine. And just make sure it's a good quality company. And probably my final thing is don't over fuss. Don't fuss too much. I get so many people that are like, oh, my plant's struggling, I'm gonna repot it. I watered it a bunch, but now I'm like letting it dry out. And I'm like, just consistency and patience is the best thing. I let my plants get pretty rough and then I clean them up because they want to go through those cycles of dropping their yellow leaves. They want to have the leaf completely die and then it get cut off. If we cut off every little bump and blemish, we're taking away tissues that are creating food for the plant. So it's important to just not over fuss. If there's a couple yellow leaves, it probably isn't a big deal. It probably has to do with growth. It probably has to do with light. It's always good to check for insects, but if you can't find any insects and you feel like you're taking care of your plant the right way, it's probably just the cycle of the plant. I mean, we have cycles too. Sometimes we're a little bit unhappy and sometimes we're really happy. Plants are the same way. It's going to change with the environment. It's going to change with the seasons. As long as nothing is happening really quickly, like you're losing 1 leaf a day and on a plant that has like 6 leaves, don't worry too much about it. Extreme leaf drop is a concern, but a couple here and there, that's fine. A little bit of winter depression when we don't have very much light, that's normal for humans and plants. So just don't get too concerned, don't freak out, don't just repot a plant just because it looks bad. Diagnose the problem, figure out if it's normal, if it's a normal cycle, and then decide what to do about it. Just don't have too much stress about it. Plants are living beings. They change as their life goes on. So yeah, that wraps up Houseplant 101, Water, Light, and Love. Let me know if you guys have any questions that you want us to address. We are gonna at some point in the future do a question where you guys can submit questions, but you can do that anytime. You can call, you can come in, you can send us a message, whatever you want, and I'm totally open to answer any question you guys have. So thank you, and I'll see you guys soon.